For thousands of years, people have been misinterpreting what's in front of their eyes, and it's a thing that everyone believes what they do and should be doing things their way. The hard reality is that it's pretty much entirely up to us to investigate solutions, and this can be no small feat, especially if we have no idea what is wrong or no clue where to begin. I hope this podcast will go some way in pointing you in a direction, that these ideas will help you draw your own conclusions. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Did everybody have a look at that piece of paper that I gave you? Everybody just thought about it a little bit, which is why I handed it out. I'm just going to read it quick. So where it comes from is it comes from this book. This book is called Flow. Classic work on how to achieve happiness. And I'll try and pronounce the author's name. The author's name is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Apparently he's a Czech guy. All right. The last great attempt to free consciousness from the dominion of impulses and social controls was psychoanalysis. As Freud pointed out, the two tyrants that fought for control over the mind were the id and the superego. The first a servant of our genes, and the second a lackey of society, both representing the other. Opposed to them was the ego, which stood for the general needs of the self connected to its concrete environment. So there's a lot of words there that we use here in the treatment center that have quite a few meanings. I know I've spoken about superego before, and I've spoken about ego before. We'll talk about them in the context of what this guy is talking about. Why I like this particular book, and I would recommend it to anybody, is this guy spent many, many years researching this stuff. Everything that's in here is backed up with science and evidence, but we'll get to it. So, if we think back thousands of years, and if we look at something like epilepsy, if somebody had an epileptic seizure 4,000 years ago, they thought that person was possessed by the devil and that they had demons in them. You can imagine someone lying on the floor shaking and foam coming out of their mouth. And that was a belief that was held for thousands of years, an incorrect belief. What we know now is that it's the way that the brain chemicals work and the brain fires that causes epileptic seizures. Another one was people with like scoliosis or hunchback were born that way because they had a overwhelming evil in them and were rejected as a result of that. So anything that was a little bit out of the ordinary, people assigned significance and meaning to these things based purely on their thinking. Now, in the very early days of astronomy, not astrology, astronomy, guys like Aristotle would just sit and think about what the stars were doing and what was happening in our solar system, what was happening in the heavens. So the fact that they thought that the Earth was at the center of the universe and that the stars were just holes pricked in a blanket was generated by people sitting in a chair like I'm sitting at the moment and thinking about where does all of this stuff come from. And that was a belief system that was held in place forever, for such a long period of time. When you had guys like Galileo who started questioning these things. I mean, they were branded as heretics. I think Galileo was nearly burned at the stake for saying that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. That's how firmly people had attached to interpretations, to perceptions of what somebody saw and what somebody thought about the universe and our place in the universe. Another interesting one that I found quite amusing that I didn't know. I mean, the stuff that I'm talking about is general knowledge, but it's important in terms of what we do here in the treatment center in perception. And what we see with our eyes, is not the best evidence. And many people say, unless I can see it, it doesn't exist. Visual evidence is unreliable. You know, you can see the stars. We're not the center of the universe. Another one is where fairies come from, which I thought was quite interesting, because apparently what happens is mushroom spores land in one spot in a field, and in an equidistant circle, the mushrooms will grow. So you can imagine some farmer walking through his field in the morning, and the next day comes there and there's a perfect circle of mushrooms where there wasn't a mushroom before, and the belief was that the fairies were using those as chairs where they would have their little circle meeting. You know, that's where that thought came from. My grandmother was Irish, and she was very, very, very superstitious, extremely superstitious, and she used to tell us all of these crazy stories. It was a very strongly held beliefs, and you know, things that they thought this is how it is, when in fact it's just the way that mushrooms grow. You know, it's not much more complicated than that. I was talking a little bit about Aristotle, and what Aristotle believed was that if you drop a feather and a rock at the same time, that obviously they don't hit the ground at the same time, so obviously the laws of gravity apply differently to a feather and a rock. He also believed that if you drop two rocks of two different sizes, that the bigger rock would fall to the earth quicker than the smaller rock. And it took 1,500 years for Galileo to disprove that theory. I think he did it on the Leaning Tower of Pisa, dropping rocks and things off the side of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And the interesting thing about the rock and the feather is the reason that the feather drifts slowly to Earth is because of the resistance of air. So in a perfect vacuum, there is no air. They do fall at the same speed. And they actually did that experiment on the moon. There's actual footage of them on the moon dropping a rock and a feather, and they both fall at exactly the same rate in the vacuum of space. Interestingly, as a side note, something that I didn't know is in a perfect vacuum, sound doesn't travel. Sound needs air because of waves to travel. And the thousands of years that they struggled between sound waves and light waves, because light obviously travels through a vacuum because it travels through space. They couldn't understand why is it that light waves can travel but sound waves can't travel, and that's a whole nother set of theories that I'm not even gonna attempt to explain. Part of the concept that I'm talking about, and I'll talk about what we read at the end of the group. But it's just something that you can just think about how that stuff applies to what I'm talking about is always the hardy-das. Yeah. Every group, it's the hardy-das. If we start looking at our theories, so the theories that I work with here in the treatment center, that I often work with in the treatment center, is people have very strong beliefs people have very strong beliefs about God in both directions. You will get people that are completely fanatical about their belief in God, and you cannot question it or challenge it or shake it, because that's what they believe. That's their interpretation of what it is that they're saying. And then you get people who have absolutely no belief in God. And both of those camps are equally difficult to work with, just based purely on belief and interpretation of what they think, as opposed to what is helpful and what is realistic. Something that I have a little bit of a personal issue with is when people think that they can get some kind of prayer that will make their problems go away. It's like that God is like this magic wand that you can just wave and, miracles will happen. And I don't believe that it happens that way. But let me not go into too much of that, because that's a whole long story. Whether somebody believes that they are an alcoholic or not, whether somebody believes that they have this disease or whether they don't have this disease. Now, you will have heard around AA and NA meetings, even if you've been to one or two, that they say that usually 3 out of 10 people, 3 out of 10 drinkers are alcoholic. There is I'm going to go shoot those birds. It's the same ones every day. There's a thing called the Pareto distribution. Has anybody heard of the Pareto distribution? The 80-20 rule. You've heard of it? You've heard anybody else heard of it? Okay, so which kind of proves the 80-20 distribution is 3 out of 10 drinkers will be alcoholic. That means 20% of people drink as much as the 80% of the other people, which is what makes us alcoholics and addicts. So this is a universal law and a universal statistic, and I'll go into it in a little bit more detail, but I just want to go back to thinking about whether I'm an alcoholic or whether I'm not an alcoholic, whether I have this disease or whether I don't have this disease. Just because I drink and use drugs does not mean that I know anything about drinking and using drugs. What I know how to do is I know how to drink and I know how to use the drugs. I know I might be an expert and a specialist in that. Doesn't mean that I know everything else about it. And people get very, very stuck in, I use drugs, therefore I know everything that there is possibly that I need to know about drugs. And that's where a lot of denial about the disease of addiction comes in, is because that's one small little segment of the whole problem. To come back just a little bit to the stuff that I was talking about with Aristotle and astronomy and those kind of things, we all assume that the planets all rotate around the sun. I mean, that's general knowledge. We have the sun and we've got all the planets rotating around. Now, a question there is, are all the planets on one axis level? Are they all on the same level, revolving around the sun at the same level? Now, I've thought about that and I've wondered about that question. I obviously live on Earth. I've been to school. I think I know everything that there is. I know a few things about the solar system. What is actually happening is the sun is moving through space. And what is happening is the planets are corkscrewing along in the gravity field of the sun. And so they're not even going around in a circle, they're going around in a corkscrew motion in a specific direction. And what the theories that the scientists have at the moment, the guys who are thinking about these things, is that the universe is expanding. That is a whole that is a whole different kettle of fish. So we have theories, and we think about things. How much arrogance goes into what we think about, one, our disease, whether we have this disease or whether we don't have this disease, whether we know what we need to do to recover or we don't know what we need to do to recover. And in terms of recovery, how do I deal with my emotions? How do I deal with anger? How do I deal with sadness? How do I deal with stress? How do I deal with the problems in my life? And do I have specific theories that I think that I know the way that things, and I don't allow anybody to contribute or speak to me about any of the things that I'm going through? I know how to recover. It's a large problem because there are a lot of people that are looking for answers and looking to recover from the problems that they have, and then go and speak to people who also... Brilliant. Go and speak to people who also think that they know, but they don't actually know. Because that's happened to me for many, many years. I was searching and I was looking, trying to solve the problem of my life, the confusion that I was experiencing, and very good intention, very well-meaning people were giving me advice and trying to tell me what to do, and they didn't know either. Which is why when I ask questions that are so important is, what was your experience and what did you do to recover from your problem? That's what interests me. I want to know what your practical experience is. What is it that you've done? Not what you've learned or your theories or anything like this. What works? So we come back to the Pareto distribution. Now this is something that's been around for a considerable amount of time. I'm just going to speak about it a little bit. These are some of the examples of how the Pareto distribution works. 20% of all the artists produce as much as 80% of the rest of the artists. Of those 20%, there's only 20% of those that become really famous and whose works we look at and whose works we see. Now that's a creative system, a system of creative productivity. What this rule is saying is that there is always going to be 20% that have more than everybody else. The question then comes in is, how do we deal with the Bill Gates, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Warren Buffetts? Because the exact same thing happens with money, where 20% of the population, 20% of the world's population is Charlie. 20% of the world's population earns as much money as the other 80% combined. Of that 20%, another 20% have as much money combined as 80% of that other 20%. Those are the super, super wealthy. And so the system goes. And then you have governments who are looking at this and saying, this is not fair. This is not how it's supposed to be. We are supposed to have a system of equality. Novelists who write books, the exact same distribution of 100 people who write books. 20 of those people are going to be the ones who sell the most books. Sell the same amount of books as the other 80%. Write books. People who write books, not only even sell books. Same 20-80 distribution. Goal scorers in the Premier League. 20% of the soccer players are going to score the same amount of goals as the other 80% of the guys who are on the field. And then you will have the super performers out of that group as well. Farming. But I'll come back to the farming, because the farming is quite an interesting one. Records, music. Records produced, hits made, artists who become famous. So 20% of the artists who have mega fame have the same amount of fame as the other 80%. This is the kind of system that, thank you. This is the kind of system that arises out of a democracy, out of what we refer to as a meritocracy, where you are rewarded for the efforts of your labor. So that means that everybody who goes out into the job market there and who's trying to do their best, 20% of the people who go out into the job market are going to be as successful as the other 80%. That's not a man-made law. That's not a law that is made by democracy, and I'll explain it to you a little bit later. And remember, what we're talking about here is we're talking about perception and the way that people see things. And we can see this a lot in our country with our politicians. And there's a reason for that as well. The size of trees. 20% of the trees are as high as, or get as much nutrition and sunlight as the other 80%. Education, which is quite an interesting one, is 20% of the people who go out to get educated. Sorry, of the people who go out to get educated, only 20% are going to get as much as the other 80% of education. I had a look at this. One of the classic examples that they use of this is, and I didn't even know, is when you grow peas. You know, green peas. When you grow green peas, 20% of the pea pods grow as much peas as the other 80% of the pea pods. That's peas. That's plants growing out of the ground. Now, I never knew about this rule until a year or two ago. You know, so I'm living my whole life wondering why things are happening to me the way that they're happening, and having no understanding about these things, and nobody ever talks about this stuff. And it's a universal law. There's evidence, in fact, to prove. You go online and look at this stuff, there's evidence for it. In a company of 10 people, 3 people will do the same amount of work as the other 7. If you have a company of 1,000 people, 100 people, they work on a square root formula. So it's the square root of 1,000 is 100. In a company of 1,000 people, there is going to be 100 that do the same amount of work as the other 900. They've done the formulas and they've done the maths. Go and research and go and have a look at yourself. And if you are uninterested or not uninterested, you don't have to take my word for any of this stuff. Go and do the research yourself. This information is available. Now the problem comes in is people don't know what to do about this, because we have the rich, and the rich get richer. And we have the poor, and the poor get poorer. And this is where you get collectivist systems, where collectivist systems come in. What can you do about it? There's nothing that we can do about it. The object, yeah? No. The object of the discussion, and the reason why I'm having this discussion, is because people get a fixed idea in their minds about how they think things should be, how the laws of the universe work, how religion works, how philosophy works, how atheism works, how the stars work, how recovery works, how alcoholism works, how the disease works, where stress fits in, where anxiety fits in. You can go and get anti-anxiety medication till it's coming out of your ears. As much benzos and antidepressants as your little heart could desire. What if it's just your interpretation about what is going on in your life that is the problem? coming back to collectivism. Collectivism is another word for socialism, communism, where everybody has the same, where there is equality, there's no rich and there's no poor. And our politicians love to speak about this thing. One of the result of collectivist thinking is we got to rip it all down so that everybody's got nothing, then we're all the same. The problem is that this universal law is in place and exactly the same thing is going to happen again. It's unavoidable. There's nothing that can be done about it. So just to talk a little bit about this, the way that Lenin proposed to address this inequality was to send his intellectuals out into the farmlands, because there were a few farmers who were good at farming and were producing the majority of the crops for the people in the Ukraine, and they shipped them all off to Siberia, where they all died. And what happened is 6 million Ukrainians died, because there was nobody left who could produce any food, because they got rid of the top performers. So millions and millions of people died. You go and look at what's happening in Venezuela, the exact same thing is happening under those same kind of systems. So you have good, well-intentioned people trying to make decisions, and everything must be fair. Something interesting that I've heard people speak about, and in my personal capacity, I don't hold much of an opinion about this, but it is a little bit relevant, where there's more of a socialist system in places like Denmark and Sweden, in the Scandinavian countries. But what they say is that the difference between people has escalated, that there's less common ground between people, that this is just that it's a whole argument that I haven't looked at. Now, there's a problem that arises out of that socialist. So basically, what I'm saying is that collective ideal can't work. If you're going to rip everything down so that nobody has anything, so that everybody's equally poor, to rebuild the system, that's insane. It's so much harder to rebuild a system than to take a system that's already working and to expand on it and to improve it and to make it better and to work with that system. A system that is going to take place anyway, just that everybody's going to have nothing and thousands of people are going to die. So then we have the meritocracy, where people are rewarded for their personal efforts. The amount of work that you put in and the amount of effort that you put in is the reward that you get at the end of the day. And it breeds inequality. Now, there's an interesting statistic that I looked at in different states. The research was done in America. In states where people are equally poor, everybody's poor, there's no violence, very little homicide, men killing men. There's very little of that taking place. And in places where there's a lot of wealth, there's very little violence. But where there's a lot of imbalance, where there's a lot of people that are very wealthy and a lot of people that are very poor, there's a lot of violence. There's a lot of homicide, people killing each other. And you know what the main reason is that people kill each other is over status and respect. Don't respect me, do you know who I am? And people kill each other. It's quite bizarre. How do you address it? How do you fix it? What is the way that you even begin to approach a problem like this? Does it have to be that either everybody has to be rich, or that everybody has to die, and that everybody has to be poor? You know, which way are we going? Which way is the solution? Which way, and what qualifies our politicians to decide? That's always the thing that interests me when we look at these really radical guys who are quite happy to kill everybody, and burn everything down. And like it means nothing, like it's inconsequential and insignificant. To go just a little bit more into the statistics, there are 195 countries in the world. 35 of those countries have the same GDP as all the rest. In South Africa, in Australia, anywhere in the world. The study that this guy did was in Australia. The top 20 cities in Australia had the most people in them, as opposed to the other 100 or whatever it is. I was quite curious, and there was another element of this that quite surprised me, because I was preparing for this talk. I wanted to make sure that all the evidence that I found supported my argument, which is not a very good way at all of addressing a lecture. I went and looked at, so you all know that I record these things to put online, to put on the podcast. And I've got 10 podcasts online at the moment. 3 of those podcasts generate the same amount of traffic as all the others. In fact, if not a little bit more. 3 of them. Which is quite fascinating for me, because if I look at what are the topics that people are interested in listening to, the podcasts that people are interested in listening to, crisis management, the top one, I think, meditation, the next one, and then there was another one that I did on the Milgram experiment and recovery. So it's the first podcast that I did, the second podcast that I did, and I think the 7th podcast that I did. Those are the ones that get the most. So there it is, right in front of me. And because I'm aware of it, I'm now thinking, because the last one that I did, the last talk that I did was about the morphic resonance. Morphic resonance. I had no idea morphic resonance even existed as a field of study, or as an idea, or as a concept, and I put it up as the title of the podcast because it really fascinated and interested me, and I thought it would interest everybody else. I think it's the one at the moment that has got the least amount of traffic of people listening to it. So it gives me an idea of where people's interests lie, and maybe something that I can address, because really everything that I talk about in these groups is about crisis management, and it is to a degree about meditation. Now, I'm running a little bit out of time here as usual. When we are children, and I think back to myself as a child, I think I was as dumb as a doorstop, and I think that's why parents also need to look after their children, because they're not very bright. They run in front of cars and get lost and wander off and all those kind of things. They need to learn, and they need to be taught. And something that I remember very clearly as a child, and something that this chap in his book Flow brings up, is that when we're growing up, we don't know how to read our parents' mood. There were times, obviously, where I was aware that something was wrong as a child, but I couldn't, in general, identify what my parents' mood was. And then I went to school, and it was also very difficult for me to identify what anybody's mood was. What I did do, though, was when I moved out of my family unit into school, is I started evaluating myself in relation to what it was that I was seeing, and coming up with theories and coming up with beliefs about how I thought things worked. and based on what I was also taught by my family, because children learn by copying, by seeing what their parents do. That's how children learn. And I remember very clearly in primary school, I didn't have a problem with any of my teachers except my Afrikaans teacher. I was terrified of her. I used to get such anxiety before I used to go to her class. I used to go to the sick room and they used to give me medicine and they used to phone my mother because I was terrified of this woman, and I had absolutely no idea why. She was very strict and very hostile. And growing up as an adult, one of the lessons that we taught is that if you live your life correctly, everything will go right. If you do everything well, you will get the outcome that you desire if you work hard enough at it. Now, I think about how that factors into something like the example that I've given of this Pareto distribution, where in primary school I had no freaking idea that these kind of ideas were out there. In high school, that these were the kind of things that, you know, were available to understand how the world works. And how little control we have over these kind of things. So it depends where you live, depends on the environment that you grow up in. If you live in a very poor environment, it will be very safe and it will be very friendly. And if you live in a very rich environment, it will be very safe and it will be very friendly. But if you live where there's a lot of inequality, it has the potential to be quite dangerous. So we're born and we live and we come into the world in situations that are beyond our control and beyond our understanding, with things taking place that are beyond our understanding. And from before time, people have been trying to figure out how best to manage ourselves through these challenges that we are faced with. Which is, I think, even why somebody was able to identify this Pareto distribution, you know, as something that's very important that we should be looking at. The information that Mihaly refers to, he talks about the Oracle of Delphi, speaking about the stuff that we're speaking about right now. And that is 1400 BC. So that's 3,500 years ago. That's what he's referring to. Plato, who was talking about the virtuous activities of the soul, 380 BC. Christianity, 2,000 years ago. And then, of course, we come to this little bit that, this little piece of paper that I handed out. Freud, who was at the turn of the century, it was like 1908, I think, where he was somewhere around there. And again, it's about how do I find a way to come to terms with how I feel about life, what is happening to me, myself, and what I think about what is taking place. How do I get a grip on what's true and what is not true? And the biggest resonating fact that I have, the thing that I found that works the best for me, the thing that I strive for through all of this, that helps me try to maintain my sanity through all of this, is to try to not interpret what is going on in my life. Because when I start trying to interpret and I start trying to fix and make everything perfect, so that my life can be perfect, I jack my anxiety and my stress levels up. You know, and medical conditions, they've got names for them: anxiety disorders and stress disorders, and you can go to the doctor. Where all it is me trying to make sense of something that can't be made sense of, something that needs to be experienced. When what my requirement is to take as much responsibility as I'm able, which might only be a little bit. Might only be able to take a little bit of responsibility. It's an interesting thing. I was at the NA fundraiser on Saturday night, and there were maybe 3 or 4 people there that were sober longer than 20 years. Out of 100 people. So there's the distribution, and we say in treatment center, 3 out of 10 people are going to survive here in the treatment center. That's what the Pareto distribution is saying. Who's it going to be? Who's going to win that lottery? What can I do about it? How do I learn to take more responsibility? And so it's a case of go out there, slay the dragon, get the gold, and help other people. That's really what the direction that the 12 steps are sending us in. Like I say, the best way that I've found to do that is to be present in my life. Not to be unconsciously analyzing every single sound like those hardy-dars out there. Why are they making a noise during my spiritual group? Because they know how spiritual we're being here. That's why they're doing it. They came because they knew. That's insane thinking. That's mad. It's certifiable. It serves absolutely no purpose. Don't interpret. And it is possible to get to that place of not interpreting if you pursue it. Take as much responsibility as you can to try and achieve that. Cool. All right, I think I'm going to leave it there. Mark Twain said something, and I believe I heard something quite amusing. Mark Twain gets accused of a lot of quotes. And I'll just read the last quote of Mark Twain. It might or might not actually be Mark Twain who said this. Courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear. So, hopefully, in this discussion, you can see a little bit of how the mind works and how misinterpretation works, on how many levels it works, and how little purpose it serves, and how much it does to jack up our anxiety and our stress levels, and how unnecessary it is, and how important it is to just be present, and how much commitment and how much dedication that takes. That one thing, that's the focus, that's the primary focus. Do that work, and all the other things are going to fall into place for you. Because it's not like you can control any of this stuff anyway.